Please don't come in my mouth. Pleading and supplicant, the girl uttered the words with her mouth inches from his cock and looking up at him with wide eyes that belayed far more innocence than there was in her. Cal Heyman looked down at the girl in irritation. It took a lot of his reserve to keep the hand that was resting in the girl's hair from clenching into a fist and slamming her mouth back down on his member. Don't worry your pretty head, Darwin, he said, guiding her expert mouth back to his dick. I'll give you plenty of warning. She went back to sucking him off, apparently placated. He leaned back and closed his eyes, letting go of everything and enjoying the impressive job she was doing. Of course she was good at it. Sally Archer was a whore, and used her mouth to earn a living. She was a 20-year-old pothead, still pretty enough to command good money for her services, and hadn't gotten hooked on heroin like half the damn kids these days. Cal was a cop, though, and they had an understanding that he was not paying for this, and she was not going to jail for it either. It was, in his opinion, a purely win-win scenario. It was sort of a get-out-of-jail-free card. He got off, and so did she. Sally was just one of many girls like her that he had made this agreement with. He called it a perk. They were in his Jeep Cruiser, parked way out on Old Harlow Road, which was far enough from town that there was little chance of being interrupted, yet close enough to respond to a call if needed. Once he had come, of course. He was technically on duty, but that wasn't really a concern. Nothing ever happened around here, anyway. This night was like the 1,000 before it and the 1,000 that would follow it. He was in a great place in life for the first time, and he intended to enjoy it. He was a cop in a small town, and he had started taking cash gifts from Emerson ever since the Indian couple had been killed. It was an easy thing to be at Emerson's beck and call, because the man barely ever needed him. His services had mainly been to lose the evidence folder that would have gotten Emerson in a heap of trouble, and at the center of a very troublesome court case. Given the man's money and resources, it was doubtful he would have spent a second in prison, but the stain on his public and business persona would be tougher to erase. Emerson was a careful man, and Cal was just an insurance card. Cal now had money and power, and all he had to do was clean up a mess that would have been swept under the rug anyway. Not a big deal. There was only a couple Indians anyway. The financial windfall he'd received was small potatoes compared to a billionaire like Emerson, but it was more than he had ever dreamed of getting. So what if the other cops, hell, the whole town, hated him? At 29, he was as close to content as he had ever been, and that was fine. He had already accomplished more than his drunk-ass father ever had in twice that span. He stiffened a little, and his focus returned to his lap as he felt his balls strain. She must have sensed it, too, because she began to pull her head back, but Cal balled the hand that had been resting in her pretty blonde hair into a fist and forced her back down. She gagged as he shot his load into her mouth, her hands beating a tattoo against the seat as she tried desperately to get out of the position she was in, but he didn't really care. He just held her there until his prick stopped spurting, and then released her. She got up with fire in her eyes, but he knew the fire would fade just as soon as he flashed some cash. Cal was learning something that Emerson had learned before he was born. Money fixes a lot of woes. Bastard, she said, wiping her mouth on her sleeve and then sweeping it across her eyes to dry some tears that had leaked out. She did this reflexively, and Cal doubted she even consciously knew she had. It was probably automatic for her. You don't tell me what to do, he said, anger flaring in an instant. It was funny how easily anger could flare after he had come, how instant his disdain for the one who had brought him pleasure crashed home. Oh, right. Mr. Big Shot Cop thinks he's the king of the fucking world. If that's the case, your majesty, why do you need to bust me to get a fucking blowjob, huh? He didn't dignify this with a response as he pulled his underwear and pants back up and fastened his belt. She had a right to be mad, he reluctantly conceded. Hell, if some guy came in his mouth, Cal probably would have shot him. He was still in control, still in a happy place, until she slapped him. He reacted too violently, and the noise of that slap was followed by the dull thud as he recoiled and hit his head on the driver's side window. Stars exploded behind his closed eyes, and it was like a switch went off in his head. She must have seen it, too, because when he turned his eyes to her, she recoiled all the way to the far door and instantly apologized. The fire that had kindled in her eyes was doused in an instant by what she saw in his own eyes. I'm sorry, Cal. I didn't mean it. He opened the door and got out. He was around the truck in a flash and yanked her door open so hard it recoiled sharply and bounced back to hit him in the arm. Sally tried to crawl across the seat, but he grabbed her by the jean shorts and pulled her out, tossing her away from the Jeep and towards the woods. She screeched at him like a cat, and she tumbled over head over heels in a jumble. He strode to her and stood over her, his fist clenched almost as tightly as his jaw, his breath heavy and ragged like an ox that had been pulling a stubborn plow. She was sprawled before him, terrified, illuminated by the moon and the mist that clung to the ground. It had been pushed aside when she landed, but it had returned quickly, creeping over her flesh with an almost indecent sloth. You fucking bitch, he said, through clenched teeth. I ought to fucking kill you. At that moment, he meant it, too. She could see it in his eyes. Please, Cal, I didn't mean it. I swear, please. He stood over her, seemingly unsure of just how to proceed, and then bent down and picked her up by her hair. He did so roughly, and then he pulled back his right arm and made a fist. Sally closed her eyes and let out a mournful whimper. Cal meant to do it, to beat the shit out of this little whore who dared slap him. Whether he meant to actually kill her or not, he didn't know and never would. As he brought the fist forward, there was an ear-shattering roar from the woods as a beast came charging forth. It moved with grace and power as it ran toward them in an odd lope that saw it plant its hands to the ground before bringing its rear legs forth, the running motion of a disfigured wolf. Cal had never seen anything like it. Its white fur, its height, its mass, the roars it charged were like something out of Greek mythology. Its intentions were clear, though. Its raw fury making his own wilt without a trace. Cal dropped the whore and ran to the Jeep. He dove into the passenger door and frantically started the engine. Sally was right behind him, and as he stole a glance back, he saw she would never make it. He closed the door on her and she slammed into it. The creature had slowed its pace, but was still only a few steps behind Sally. He saw her face, tears coursing down her pretty cheeks and eyes wide in abject terror. The mouth that had so recently been forced onto his cock turned down in a rictus of horror. "For Christ's sake, Cal, open the door!" He hit the gas and sped away, spattering her with exhaust fumes and roadside pebbles. She looked at the receding Jeep's taillights in disbelief, momentarily forgetting the reason she was so desperate to get in the Jeep in the first place, until the breathing behind her reminded her that she was not alone. Sally turned and looked at the monster. It looked back at her, and then it howled again, and she covered her ears and closed her eyes, her mind unhinged, hiding from the reality of what she was sure would be an awful death. She huddled into a fetal crouch and awaited it. Death didn't come. The beast let out a hard roar again and bounded off. It had been gone a full 5 minutes before she opened her eyes. She was sure it would be waiting there, sadistically waiting for her eyes to behold it once more before it shredded her face with its claws, but it never did. When she finally opened them and saw she was alone, Sally ran and hid behind a tree and waited, still in the fetal position and rocking with her thumb corked securely in her mouth. Her eyes were glassy orbs, just useless gobs in a head that housed a mind that had shattered. Cal was doing 40 when he saw it in his rearview mirror. The creature was bounding after him in a loping trot, its massive arms pistoning down to allow its huge legs to shoot forward and get purchased and spring ahead. It was gaining speed. He pushed his foot down and drove faster, past 50. It still gained with unnatural speed, its ungraceful gallop propelling it ever closer. He could see it so clearly, yet still he could not quite believe it. The entire situation had all the ethereal quality of a dream. How he'd been getting a blowjob, to being ready to beat the woman in a fit of rage, to the horrid monster's appearance and its inability to outrun it. The beast loped up alongside the Jeep even at its top 60, and stared into the window at him, keeping pace with ease. Its soulless eyes bored into his. They were sunken deep into its face, dark circles making the white eyes that much more intense, and the whiteness of the eyes giving such horrid depth to the absolute blackness of its pupils. It was running at 60 miles an hour, not even breathing heavy. It grinned in at him with its toothless mouth as it paced him, its long serpentine tongue lolling as it dangled. He was mesmerized, and that was his undoing. He saw the turn coming. Hell, he knew this road as well as any other in this town. But he didn't want to slow down. The Jeep's tires screeched as they tried to keep purchase with the blacktop of the road, and he felt the center of balance floating away and knew he was going to flip. He didn't, though. His screeching tires held, and as he cleared the bend, they regained their grip, and the Jeep settled back into an upright position on the road. He was exhilarated in an odd way he could not have explained, and let out a loud "woo!" in his excitement. He was so focused on his victory that when he came out of the turn, still doing damn near 60, and saw it was in the road, there was simply no way, no time, to avoid it. A solid white pillar stood in the middle of the road. It was like someone had stood a support column right in the damn street. He slammed his foot on the brake, too little and far too late, but the Jeep hit it at well over 50, and the front end crumpled around the column like it hit a very old, very solid tree. Cal had neglected to put on his seatbelt in his haste to escape the creature, so when the truck stopped moving, he did not. He had time to throw his arms up in a desperate, futile attempt to shelter his head. It worked, too, sort of. Cal hit the windshield and went through it like it wasn't even there. He was going to be splattered against the pillar, and that was almost a relief, because he had looked into that creature's eyes and seen no mercy there. Instant death would be preferable to whatever it had in store for him. That didn't happen, though. He sailed straight through the pillar as it lost cohesion. It was like passing through a cold spot when you're swimming in a lake. The bottom of the pillar had destroyed his truck, but this higher section had all the solidity of cotton candy, and it slowed him not a jot. He flew for almost 30 feet before hitting a tree. That impact knocked the wind from him and shattered his left collarbone. It also altered his trajectory, sending him rebounding off another tree in the process, which broke his right leg like a pencil. He could hear sickening crunches coming from somewhere deep inside of him with each impact, and he hit the ground hard, rolling over a few times before his momentum was finally spent. He had come to a halt almost 20 feet deep in the woods. When he landed, Cal was a bleeding, moaning heap. He was on his side, lying on an arm that was broken in 4 places. He was breathing in great gasps of air that had gone cold and bitter, yet could not see his breath. He lay as he had landed, trying like hell to get up, to run, to do anything other than what he was doing, which was lie on the ground like fresh roadkill. He could not feel any pain below his waist, which was alarming since everything above shrieked like he had been dipped in acid. He was bleeding from a dozen cuts along both arms, and his right arm, both ulna and radius bones, had poked through the skin like grotesque straws. He tried again to move, but nothing worked. His left arm was almost mobile, but the rest was just broken. He was just broken. Cal heard it coming, and that made him try one last time to move. He mustered all of his strength and will, yet only managed to flop over on his belly like a beached fish. He reached forward and tried to drag himself through the dirt and old leaves that he had landed in. The mist found him first, and soon he was inhaling it and gasping for breath that was increasingly difficult to draw in. It tasted awful in his mouth, like ice cream gone bad, and he gagged as it entered his lungs. He also heard a cacophony of whispers, just out of the range of his hearing to make any sense of. It was maddening, after everything else he was going through, to have that incessant whispering in his ears, like there was a crowd of spectators just out of sight, and not one of them could be bothered to stop gawking and help him. The creature stepped into the woods and loped over to where Cal was pathetically crawling towards whatever salvation he thought he had crawled to. It grabbed his left arm and rolled him over roughly. Cal shrieked as his arm bones ground together outside of his skin, where the nerves assured him loudly that they sure as fuck should not be. He panted as the thing brought its snout down to his face, recoiling as best he could as the frigid drool plastered his face with sticky ropes that seared him with cold. It opened wide its jaws and lowered its head. The thing had breath like an open grave, and it moved over him slowly. A connoisseur contemplated an exquisite feast. "Please, God," he whispered to the night. "Please don't let this happen. Please." He felt the claws slice open his belly, and if he thought he had reached some threshold of pain the human body can endure, some place where the nerves simply blew out like overtaxed circuit breakers, he was mistaken. Cal let out a scream of agony as his steaming innards were exposed to the frigid air. He felt the sickening emptiness of his torso as his intestines spilled out of his gut and then spooled around his torso. He looked down and saw the open mouth of the creature as it slid towards him. It was red and raw, and as he watched the teeth slide from hiding in the gums like the claws of a cat, heard the creature's yelp of pain as it did, and then saw it lower its snout into his flesh. He could feel its invasive mouth as it rooted around for something worth eating, and then the hard tug as its jaws clenched on some vital part of his insides and pulled him back. It raised its snout to the sky and snapped its jaws, and Cal saw some piece of him, slide into its mouth and bulge in its throat as the thing gulped. It swallowed that piece of him, and then let out its mournful, chilling howl before once more returning to its meal, its white muzzle now streaked maroon with Cal's blood. It bit deeper into him, and he tried to raise his good arm in some last act of defiance or supplication, but it was too much effort. It was too damn heavy. There was a darkness surrounding his vision now, and though he knew it was death outside the edge of his sight, he dove for it. Blackness stole his eyes, but it was a while before he died, and all that time there were sounds as it made a meal of him. The snapping of its jaws as it tore pieces of him from his body and swallowed them. Last of his senses to go was touch, though. Even though he was so far removed from hope and life, he simply wouldn't yield, and even as he wished for it to be over, he felt it root and tug and bite for what felt like hours. Then, mercifully, death. The creature ate for over an hour, then it paused. Dawn was coming. And when that happened, the beast needed to be far from here, somewhere secret, somewhere safe. It acted on instinct when not guided by the voices from the pouch, and it knew what had to be done. The feast was over, yet the hunger remained as it always would. No logic entered into this equation for the Wytiko. It would simply eat until it had finally had its fill. If not this meal, then certainly the next. It reached down and grabbed Cal's lifeless body by the exposed ribs and walked over to a large tree. Cal's feet made distinct drag marks through the earth, but the Wytiko did not. The passage of its great bulk did not disturb so much as a leaf as it walked through the undergrowth. As if reality itself, it refused to acknowledge its existence. The Wytiko paused, and then reached up to snag a branch off of the tree. It did so easily, leaving a pointed stump 10 feet off the ground. It snarled and slammed Cal's body onto its makeshift stake. Why it did this, the Wytiko could not say, except that it was a creature born of vengeance, and vengeance demanded symbols. Let them know that things were not right in these woods. Let them know that they were all merely food for its never-ending hunger. Let them know the night stalked them with cold death in its heart. Let them know. It stalked deep into the woods, and just before the sun appeared over the distant mountains, it had holed up under a dense thicket of trees and fallen into a thin sleep, where the piercing sun could not interrupt its dreams of coming violence and the feast of flesh.